皆さんこんばんは。
Good evening,
顔が見えてない
everyone.
のに、皆さんこんにちはっていうのすごく変な
It's
感じ
kind
なん
of
ですけど
awkward
も、
to say good evening, even though I
本
cannot
イベ
really
ント
see
をご
people
指導くだ
on
さ
the
り、
other
皆さん
side.
どうもあ
But
りがとうご
once
ざいま
again,
す。
thank you very much for participating
私
in
は
this
東京
event.
都現代美術
I
館で今
am
開催している
currently one of the
もつれる者
curators
たち
of
展の
this
キュレーターの一人
exhibition
で、
called
同館の
Things
学芸員を
Entangling
務めてお
at
りま
the
す J キョンファ
Museum
と申し
of
ます。
Contemporary Art. My
この
name
展覧
is
会
J
は、
Kyung-fa.
パリ
It's very
とサン
nice
フラ
to
ン
meet
シスコ
you.
を拠点
This
に現代
exhibition
美術の収
is
集と、
having the
展
collection
示、あるいはレ
exhibition
ジデ
and
ンスを
also
行い、
residence of the
また
modern
世界
arts
各地でアーティス
stationed
トや
in
キュレー
Paris
ター
and
や、
San
文
Francisco.
化組織と共同してい
And
るカディスト
we
の共
are
催です。
collaborating with
展覧
KADIST,
会の共同キュ
which
レーターの
is
ロディ
also
ロワイさん
the
とは、
cultural
2015年か
organization
ら
in every
徐々
different
にこの展の
countries.
準備をしてき
Well,
ま
the
した。
co-curator
今日
Elodie
エロディさん
Royer
も一緒に司会を
and
する予定だっ
myself
たんですけ
started
ど
to
も、
work on
ちょっ
this
とやむを得な
exhibition
い事情
since
で、 参
2015.
加が叶わないことに
Elodie
なり
was
ました。
supposed to
来
participate
週の
tonight,
この会には
but
ぜひ一緒に
unfortunately
参加できれ
Elodie
ばな
san
と思いま
cannot
す。
make it. I hope that
この展覧会もで
Elodie
すね、
can
新型
join
コロナ
us
感染
in
症
the
の
next
影響を
week.
受けて、開催
Due
が
to
ほぼ3ヶ月遅れ
COVID-19,
たり、
this exhibition
アーティス
has
トの
been
来日
delayed
ができなくな
by
ったり、
3 months
計
in
画
terms
し
of
てい
the
たイベントのい
opening.
くつかが
Artists
中
could
止または
not
変
come
更
to
となりました。
Japan, and several
なのでこの
events
イベントはです
have
ね、唯
been
一アーティ
cancelled
スト
or
の声を
delayed.
直接
So
皆さんに
this is
お届け
the
できる機
only
会となります。
opportunity to
展覧
communicate
会には
directly with the
12組の
artist.
アーティストが参加し
We
ていて、
invited 12
作品
artists
はあ
at
る
this
具体的な場
exhibition,
所や
and
時代と
their
結びついたも
artwork
のの
is
移動、
tied
あるい
to
は意
the
味の変
specific
遷などを
location
た
or
どって
times,
ものに作
and
用して
maybe
い
there
る
is
さ
a
まざまな
movement
力を
or
読み解き
maybe
な
the
がら、
evolution of
既
the
存の
meanings. We
歴史や
try to
普
track
遍的な
all
現
of
実に異を
those
加え
and
て、
trying to
あるいは
interpret
新たな
how
歴史の
that
層や視
means,
座を見出すた
trying
め
to
の
really
芸術
understand
的
the
な実践を
existing
見ることができ
history
ます。
or maybe the hegemony's statement, trying to really challenge those and then
このアーティス
trying
トとの
to
対
put
話
the
では、
new layer of the
12組の
history
中から
and
4
trying to
名のア
find
ー
a
ティストを
new
招いて、
perspective.
展示作品を中
In
心
this
にそれぞれ
today's
のお仕事
event,
について
we
お話をさせていただきます。
invited 4 artists out of 12, and
その
they
後、
will be talking
東
about
京をベー
their
スに
own
している
artwork.
編集者
And
で
then
翻訳者でも
we
ある
have
アンドル・マーク
Andrew
ルさん
Maerkle, who
に
is
デ
an
ィスカッサン
editor
トとし
and
て入
also
っ
a
ていただいて、
translator here in
視聴者
Tokyo.
の皆さんから
He'll
の
be
質問
joining
も
us,
交えて、
with
議論ができれば
as an
なと思いますの
discussant,
で、
and then
皆さんぜ
maybe
ひ
we can answer to some of the
質
questions
問
from
をお
the
送りいただければ
audience.
と思い
So
ま
I
す。
hope that you share your
で、
questions
今
with
日はです
us.
ね、テーマとしては、
So the theme
物の
for
変換
tonight
を想像したり、
is
あるいは
maybe
物の変換を
thinking
めぐ
about
る
the
対立の背景をめ
repatriation
ぐりなが
or
ら、
maybe thinking
描
about the
きうる未来、
conflict from
もしく
that
は更新可能
repatriation.
な政治
Maybe we
的、あ
can
るいは文
think
化的な
about the
認識のあり
future
方
or
というもの
maybe
を探
the
求する作品です。
renewable
もちろ
political
ん
or cultural
表現方法
understandings.
は全く違うんで
Or
すけども、
there are totally different
本
ways
展
to
で相
express
対的なモニュ
those.
メントをシェラルと
One
いうインスタ
is
レーションを展
the
示されている
comparative
ニコルソンさんと、
monument.
パ
That's
ルテ
an
ノンマーブル
installation
という、
by Tom
これま
Nicholson.
で様々
And
な
the
場所
other
で
one
継
is a
続的
Platinum
に
marble.
行われて
I
いる
think
ア
this
クションを
is
展示した
the actions
アレクサンドラ・
which
ピー
is
チさんをお招きして
ongoing
います。
at different locations.
お
We
二人を
invited
非常に手
Alexandra
短なんで
Pirici.
すけども紹介します。
I'd like to introduce
トム・ニコ
themselves.
ルソンさん
Tom
はメルボルン
Nicholson
をベースに
is
活動してい
stationed
て、
in Melbourne,
ドローイング、
and he has
映
been
像、イン
engaged
スタレーシ
in
ョン、
drawing,
アクション
film,
といったメディアを
installation,
使っ
and
て、
action.
オー
Using
ストラ
those
リアに
media,
おける植民
he
地主義
is
的な
thinking
そ
about
して
the
現在の
past and
姿勢、
present of
ま
the
た、
Australian
国家の在り
colonialism,
方について、
and also how
時
the
に
state should
オースト
be.
ラリアの美術
Sometimes
史に
he
触
touched
れながら
upon the
作
art
品、作
history
品
in
形成とかをする
Australia,
ことがで
trying
きます。
to produce his
ピリチさ
artwork.
んは
Miss
ブカレストとベ
Pirici
ルリンを拠点
is
に各
stationed
地
in
で
Bucharest and
活動してい
Berlin,
るアーティストで、
and she
コ
is
レオグ
one
ラファーでもあり
active
ます。
in different
展
locations,
示
and
室
she is
や
a
公共
choreographer.
空間を使ったア
Well,
クシ
she
ョンや
is
パ
using
フォーマンス
exhibition hall
は
or public space to
既存の
demonstrate
モニュ
her
メントや
action and performance,
彫刻が表彰する
or
力、
maybe
もし
the
くは歴史
power
といったも
or
のに身体
history
を持っ
of the
て介入
existing
し、
monument
新た
can
な意
be
味や歴
intervened
史の
with
解
the
釈が
studies
どのように
and
生
trying
成さ
to
れうるのかと
explore
いうことを
the new
身体
meaning
の物
or
質
maybe
性、
interpretation
パフォーマ
of the
ティブ
history.
あるい
So
は
the
集団性という
materialism
観
of
点
the
から研
body,
究されています。
performativity,
お二人
and
には
also
今日それぞれ
collectivity.
20分
Those
程
are
度、
the perspectives of
お
Miss
話をいただい
Pirici.
て、その
They
後
will
全体の議
be
論に入る予
speaking
定
for
にしていま
20
す。
minutes followed by the
発表に入
discussions.
る前に皆さんにいく
Prior
つか
to
ご
the
連絡です。
presentation, I have some
このセッ
housekeeping
ションは、
announcements.
Zoom
This session
と、
is
現代美術館の
actually
YouTube のチャンネル
offered
の両方
on
で配信
both
しています。
Zoom and
後日、
YouTube channel of
当
MOT.
館の YouTube の
At
方
later
で、
stage,
アーカイブと
you
して見られる
can
ことになります。
watch the archived version on
で、皆
YouTube.
さんからいただく質問なんで
The
すけども、
questions which you
大
may
変恐
raise,
縮なんですが、Zoom のチャッ
unfortunately,
ト機能
you
で
can
の
only
み
ask
の
questions
対応と
using
なってい
chat
ますので、
function on Zoom.
YouTube からの
You cannot
質
ask
問が
questions
受けら
from
れない
YouTube.
ことに
So
なって
that's
ます。
the only
すいま
thing
せん。
which you have to be
ご了承
aware.
ください。で、今日こ
And
のイントロダクションの後
after
は
my
ずっと英
introduction,
語になります
it
の
will
で、
be fully
Zoom で
English.
日本語
So
通訳
if
で
you would
視
like
聴
to
されたい
listen to
方
the
は、
Japanese
この
translation,
の地球マークの言
you
語から、
select
言語選択から日本
Japanese
語を選択
from
してくだ
the
さい。
globe
で、YouTube を
icon.
使っている
If you
方は、
are
イヤ
on
ホンの
YouTube,
この左右
I
で、
think you
言
can
語が分かれる仕
differentiate
組みになってますので、
the language
日本語が
depending
流れ
on
てくる
which
方で
side
聞い
of
て
the
いただければ
earphones
なと
you
思います。
use. So you
で、
just
1時間
use
半で、
the one which is
途中休憩はなし
for
で
the
そのまま
Japanese.
走ろうか
We
と
will
思います。
not
それ
break.
ではま
We
ず、
are going till the
今日の
very
ニコル
end.
ソン
So
さん
without
にお
further
話を
ado,
いただき
we'd like
ま
to
す。
invite Mr.
So,
Tom
Tom,
Nicholson.
I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Kyungfa. It's a pleasure to be talking tonight. I'm sorry that I didn't get the chance to come and see the exhibition and install the show and meet other artists, but tonight is a very nice compensation for that. I'll just begin to share some images with you all. Can everyone see those images okay? I want, before I begin, just to acknowledge that I'm one of the lucky people who is speaking in his mother tongue, and I'm conscious that the Australian accent is an unusual accent or an unfamiliar accent for many people. So please let me know if I'm speaking too fast or too unclearly. I want to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, the original owners of the land where I'm speaking, where I live and where I work. Part of this is to acknowledge that the ramifications of invasion, the realities of invasion are ongoing and unresolved legally, economically, and morally. Tonight, I want to mainly talk about the work which is in this exhibition, Comparative Monument Shalal. But I thought it would be good to begin by briefly talking about two works that precede that work and that together form a kind of triptych that was conceived together. And the first of these is a work that you're seeing a detail of here, Comparative Monument Palestine in 2012, which is a work which begins with the very strange phenomenon of war monuments in Australia that bear the name Palestine, that were mostly built in the 1920s after World War I, in which many Australian soldiers fought with the British in Ottoman Palestine. Most famously in this place here, Bir Saba is the Palestinian name, or Beersheba is the name of the city that it's most often given in Australia, where Australian soldiers participated in a battle which was very significant and which helped to precipitate the Balfour Declaration a couple of days later. So it had very profound and far-reaching historical consequences. Comparative Monument Palestine imagines the idea of gathering together and relocating these monuments that bear the name Palestine alongside this site here, which is between the old historical Ottoman city of Bir Saba and the new glassy, prosperous Israeli city. It imagines that monument, potential monument, but it also is a concrete work which is 9 posters which are to be taken away, which document 9 of these monuments which bear the name Palestine in and around Melbourne, where I live, and which textually describes the imagined monument, which are also to be pasted up around the exhibition, in this case, Ramallah in the West Bank. The second work that I just wanted to very briefly mention before I talk about the work in the exhibition is Comparative Monument Mamen Allah from 2014, which I worked on or began to work on during that first project, and which centres on a very remarkable site just outside the historical walls of the old city of Jerusalem. It's the Mamen Allah or Mamilla cemetery, the most historically important Islamic cemetery in historical Palestine, here pictured in late Ottoman times. But what is really extraordinary about this site now is that it is completely overrun with very, very large, even monumental eucalyptus trees, which are, of course, native to Australia and very, very important trees in the place where I come from, and which were planted very, very extensively by early Zionists in the period before Israel's formation, and which have self-sown all over this cemetery, so that the contemporary view of this cemetery is more like a forest of trees. And this work evolved partly reflecting on the meanings of trees and invasion as a kind of frieze which textually describes a walk from one tree to the next, and there are 69 of them in the cemetery, as well as archival photographs from those different vantage points which are currently occupied by those trees, as well as a collection of 69 seeds, which you might be able to just make out in this image here, a seed from each of those trees, which has overgrown the Mamilla cemetery, and which at the very, very end of the work become a proposition that those seeds become the basis of a planting back here in Australia, so that the seeds from each of those 69 trees are returned to Australia in a gesture which is somewhere poised between homecoming and exile, and create a kind of doppelganger of the formation of 69 trees in that very remarkable cemetery. And of course also become a way to repeat the itinerary, to walk that walk between those 69 trees, but in a different landscape here in Australia rather than in that extraordinary cemetery in Jerusalem. I wanted to just briefly talk about those earlier works, partly just to contextualize the work which is in the exhibition in Tokyo. All of the works, in a way, follow these very strange links between Australia and Israel-Palestine, which many of which occur, of course, through the network of the British Empire and colonialism. But there are also, of course, echoes between the two contexts, since they're both settler colonial contexts. And in this sense, there are characteristics shared between the two, between here and Israel-Palestine, which are very much part of what the works attempt to explore. It's important that all of these works, including the one I'm about to talk about, also grapple with the monument and the idea of reimagining what a monument might be, and specifically doing that through the form of propositions where ideas are not fully realised but are rather conjured or described and asked to be imagined. And perhaps the most important thing, and something that we can perhaps talk about at the end, is that all three works share a procedure of moving things between contexts. What happens when one thing is moved from one place to another what latent meanings are animated, what potentials are elicited by one thing being moved from one context to another. The main work that I wanted to talk about is the work which appears in this exhibition, Comparative Monument Shalal, which was made over a sort of 2 or 3 year period. And it is a work, this is a detail of the work from its exhibition in Sydney at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, which is the museum which owns the work. And it's a project which begins with a very extraordinary mosaic, which is known as the Shalal mosaic, which comes from this place here. This is a photograph in 1917 from the year and the place and the hilltop where the Shalal mosaic was discovered. It was discovered by accident when Australian soldiers who were fighting with the British against the Ottoman army took an Ottoman position on a hill where Ottoman soldiers had dug 2 trenches which accidentally exposed fragments of a mosaic. And the Australian soldiers, after they had taken the position and noticed the mosaic pieces, began to uncover this mosaic. And they discovered the Shalal mosaic, which is one of the most important and beautiful mosaics of the Byzantine period from the Levant. It's originally a church floor. It's an early Christian mosaic. Here are 2 drawings made not long after the mosaic was unearthed, and you can see those 2 scars which run across the mosaic, which is the damage caused by the trenches. But you can also see that it doesn't really look like a Christian mosaic. It looks more like an ancient Roman or Hellenic mosaic, which is, of course, its art historical sources. And it's mainly images of animals who are meant to symbolize particular virtues or values that would govern our shared conduct. So, and in that sense, the Shalal mosaic is a kind of precursor to medieval bestiaries, which were a kind of lexicon or dictionary of animals that symbolized values and virtues for our shared conduct together. The Shalal mosaic was documented, it was photographed. This is a beautiful photograph of the tiger at Shalal just after the mosaic was unearthed. It was also drawn. A young soldier who was an amateur watercolorist made these, I think, very beautiful watercolor studies in situ. But most importantly, the mosaic was stolen. It was broken up into parts and transported back to Australia. And one of the reasons for this is that, by coincidence, the Shalal mosaic was discovered by accident in the same week that the Australian War Memorial was conceptualised. So the institution, which is the national monument and memorial, but also the National Museum to Australian Wars, was by chance conceptualised in that same week that the mosaic was discovered. And the mosaic was then stolen from Palestine and taken back to Australia to become the foundational visual object of this new museum. And it was, when the museum was built, it was built into the wall of one of the main spaces of the museum, the Hall of Valour, as a vertical surface this time. And not only that, the museum itself was built in a kind of quasi-Byzantine architectural language prompted by the Shalal mosaic, which is very, very strange. There's no historical reason for this. But the thing that's most interesting for me and is important for this project is that it also prompted the most significant space in the Australian War Memorial, the Hall of Memory, to be decorated in mosaics by the Australian artist Napier Waller. And this Hall of Memory sits directly above the Hall of Valour. So this mosaic dome here sits directly above the Shalal mosaic. It's a very strange 1930s work. It kind of looks like a Christian ascension, and it's obviously very deeply nationalist in its visual language and in what it suggests about the nature of sacrifice and eternity in ways that I find disturbing. It's also visually an interesting work, though, I think, particularly optically. Napier Waller devised a very elaborate system of bands of colour, which are evident in these scallop forms and which create a very amazing optical effect and sense of ascension. The thing that I'd probably just want to note for you, for those who have not been to Australia or to Canberra, is that the Australian War Memorial occupies a very particular place in the national capital. It's designed to be on an axis with the National Parliament, which it faces. And the two make a kind of very strong link around Australian nationalism and Australian militarism. The interesting thing about the institution is that it includes and links Australia to many different places, because all of the wars that Australia has fought in officially are actually on other territories. None of them were in Australia officially. And so there are a range of idiosyncratic connections to other places, and one of them is to Palestine. But the most important thing to note here is that, in a way that is very typical of the culture and the politics of the country where I live, the British war of invasion of the continent itself is not acknowledged as a war. It is not included or acknowledged in the institution. And this is a very important thing. It's a kind of willful amnesia, which is very much part of Australian nationalism and militarism, and is present, I think, also in this space, which I'm showing you here. Quite early in the project, I visited the hilltop where the mosaic was taken with Jack Persekian, the wonderful director of El Mamel Foundation for Contemporary Art, who is the person who invited me to do all of these three projects. And El Mamel has been an incredibly generous supporter of all of these projects. And when we finally found the hilltop where the mosaic was taken in 1917, it was very arresting and uncanny to stand on that hilltop and to think of the mosaic in Canberra on the other side of the world. The thing that I had not expected is that because it is a very flat landscape in that part of Palestine, you can see for a very long way from that hilltop. In fact, it is the only place in that landscape where you can see two very, very important cities that are historically linked, but whose contemporary realities are very, very far apart. From that hilltop where the Shalal mosaic was taken, you can just see, at the very limits of seeing, the skyscrapers of Beersheba or Beer-Saba, and you can just make out the outline of Gaza City. And although it sounds like a banal thing, it's very affecting to stand in that place and to be able to see those two cities, which are historically deeply connected through families and trade and culture and histories, but which have very, very different contemporary realities. One being a very prosperous Israeli city, the other being a very deeply a place which has had Israeli military violence visited upon it in very dramatic and terrible ways. And of course, the two cities are separated by the separation wall. So to stand there and to see those two cities in one field of vision was affecting and became an important part of the project. one of the things which really animated the project at the beginning, or the thing which animated this project at the beginning, was trying to answer the question, what would it be to repatriate the Shalal mosaic? How to imagine repatriating that mosaic to the place from which it was taken. And a more conventional way of repatriating that mosaic, which was impossible in the sense that the mosaic is built into the Australian War Memorial and difficult to remove without damaging it. It's also complex because it is not clear to whom the mosaic should be repatriated, in the sense that it was taken from Ottoman Palestine, but the site of the Shalal mosaic sits in contemporary Israel. But I was most interested in thinking the process of repatriation in a more complicated or complicating way, and began a process of imagining or thinking, what would it be to repatriate the Shalal mosaic, but using the tiles from Napier Waller's dome mosaic. And I began a very, very complex process of very, very carefully remaking all of these components of the Shalal mosaic, but using the tiles from Napier Waller's dome mosaic. And I was very fortunate in that to work with the Mosaic Centre in Jericho in the West Bank, a very remarkable institution, and to work with two mosaicists, Rafat Al-Khatib and Renan Barham, who worked with drawings or cartoons that I made here in Australia to create the fragments of that Shalal mosaic very, very carefully and exactly, but using the chromatic scheme of Napier Waller's dome mosaics. So in this fragment, you can see something of the bands of colours that are taken from the Napier Waller mosaic dome in Canberra. And two things, I guess, happen here. One is that that very regular geometric system of colours comes to be bent and twisted into the elaborate folds of the Byzantine mosaic. And the second is another kind of disorganisation, because the figurative presence of those animals comes to be confused or transformed by these new colours, by different chromatic scheme. And so there's a kind of double entanglement where the colour system of Napier Waller is disorganised at the same time that the figurative scheme, that lexicon of animals that would symbolise different values and virtues, are also disorganised. It, of course, plays with the idea of a mosaic itself, that a mosaic is made up of tiny units, tiny bits that can be pulled apart and reorganised and put together in a different way. But it's also playing with, or really trying to think about, what it means to repatriate something when the object actually then starts to accumulate some of the meanings of the context that it is being repatriated from. It was important that the work is presented as it is in Tokyo in crates and boxes, emulating the photograph which I showed to you a moment ago. And also, I hope, suggesting that the mosaic is not yet in place. It's not yet on that hilltop where it was taken in 1917, which the work asks you to imagine. But maybe the most important thing for me about presenting the work this way is not just that it asks you to imagine the mosaic as something to look at, installed back on that hilltop near Gaza at Shalala, but it may be even more than that, that it asks you to imagine that mosaic as a platform, as a horizontal surface to stand on, a place to look out from at that landscape and to see Gaza City and Bir Saba in the same field of vision, as a kind of anticipation or indication of that polity, Palestine. I wanted to just say two more things. I actually don't know how much I run over time. I suspect that I have. I wanted to very briefly mention that the work is accompanied by two videos, one of which includes a set of interviews with a very significant Palestinian Bedouin elder, Nouri El-Okber, who appears here in this image, who lives near Bir Saba and the site of the Shalal mosaic. Here he's pointing to the skyline of Bir Saba. And Nouri El-Okber is an extraordinary activist who's worked for many years on Palestinian Bedouin rights in that part of Israel. And in that video, he talks about this process, about his battles with the Israeli legal system to reclaim his land. And we visit the site of the Shalal mosaic. We visit Shalala, which is where this video still is from here. But the final thing I would like to say is the last image. This is a video still from the end of the video in the work, and it shows, or it imagines, Napier Waller's dome with those tiles removed, because it was important for this work that the process of the work generates a set of mosaics which try to imagine the repatriation of the Shalal mosaic, a set of mosaics that are really conceived for that hilltop near Gaza in Palestine. But I also was very aware that it would produce a second form, that it would produce a kind of a scar or an absence in the seamless unity of that dome. And it's important, particularly given the way that the Australian War Memorial as an institution, but also Australian culture in general, does a very poor job at acknowledging the history of invasion, which is so central to the history of this place and to its realities. It was important to make a kind of scar into that dome to suggest an incompleteness in it rather than a unity, and also to echo those scars in the Shalal mosaic, which were made in 1917. I'll leave it there, and I hope I haven't spoken for too long, and leave it to you, Alexandra, to talk about your work.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the presentation, and it's also very nice to be able to be here and speak a little bit about the Parthenon marbles, which again we were lucky enough to make happen in these conditions in Tokyo as well. It's a live performative work, so it implied quite some effort also from Kyungfa and everyone and LOG, and so the whole team involved in its reinstallation, so to say. Maybe I just say a couple of words about my practice before that. It's also funny because I guess it's not very often that within also contemporary art networks, you as an artist, you get to come either from a place that has not been, let's say, implicated in more recent Westernization on different in different ways, and it's not based in one of these quite important strongholds of accumulation. I just wanted to make a very small correction. I'm not actually based in Berlin. So I'm just based in Bucharest. I'm still based in Bucharest, Romania, which is a small Eastern European country with, if you Google it, I think it also tells you something about its history. We've of course, Romania has its own I think issues in terms of nationalism and ethnicities, and I think as everywhere today, they become maybe even more present. but I'm saying that also because I think it has something to do with the position from which I was also invited to make a work about dislocation and let's say colonial spoliation and so on. So I'm an artist. I've worked mostly in visual art contexts for many years, but I come from dance and choreography, and most of my works rely on live performers and live presence. So they function with the help of human bodies, live human bodies. There are some works that also involve other devices, like a Pepper's Ghost display, which projects this sort of hologram, let's say, performer, or a content ranking algorithm, or I've recently worked on an online text-based game. But let's say that the live element is always part of my work, so it always from. And I'm also quite interested in using this medium of performance and live presence to can you still hear me? I just said that the internet connection was unstable. So, yeah, so I'm interested in using live presence to unsettle, or let's say redraw traditional or existing toxic power relations. And Parthenon Marbles is a performative work. It's an ongoing action with live performers. It takes as a reference Parthenon Marble, the British Museum collection, which are quite famous art objects, and they have been requested back by the Greek state for a while. So they are the subject of an ongoing debate and controversy, as much as it can still be called a controversy, actually. And of course, the British Museum is not really thinking seriously about a possible repatriation. I was invited, so the work came about in this quite particular context. The work, which is again a performative action with 5 people who move through these sculptural forms that belong to the Parthenon marbles, while also speaking about the history of the Parthenon marbles, about their function also as assets, let's say. So they refer also to the financial aspect of art today and of art collections. They speak about the collection of the British Museum. They also go a little bit into the concept of a financial derivative. So they try to, let's say, circulate value associated with the static Parthenon marbles in the British Museum and redistribute it throughout different locations in the world. And this work came about in this following context. It was 2017. It was 2016, actually. And I was invited by Future Climates and State of Concept in Athens to think about a work in relation to the city. And they had also subsequently partnered with KADIST in Paris. But the invitation somehow came to think about a work in relation to the city of Athens for 2017, which was also the year in which Documenta was supposed to happen. And it was supposed to have this, in my opinion, rather interesting task of installing an exhibition both in Kassel and in Athens. But let's say that the State of Concept, so the Athens art space, was interested also in inviting reflections on this context at this particular moment in time, where it was also supposed to host Documenta. And I think that the topics that were around in the air were, of course, this divide between north and south, east and west, and is this discrepancies in power and wealth, and again quite clear talks about also financial issues and disproportionate power relations, and reading about the Parthenon marble, somehow that felt like a perfect entry point into these questions of asymmetries of power and wealth, and then what do these asymmetries afford, or how they enable the expansion or the increasing of these asymmetries. So I proposed an embodiment of the Parthenon marbles. And the work with the 5 performers moving through sculptures and again telling a different story about the marbles was first performed. It was shown as an open rehearsal in the KADIST gallery in Paris, and then it was performed, let's say, for the very first time on the Acropolis of Athens, right in front of the Parthenon. Basically very, very close to the place of dislocation of, let's say, the original sculptures, and then also performed at the State of Concept Gallery, which is in Athens, right somehow underneath the Acropolis hill. So talking about issues of repatriation, in a sense, I think this performative gesture could be well associated with a form of, let's say, bringing the objects back through this, I like to call it a rematerializing via the bodies of the performers. But at the same time, I think there was another interest I also want to specify that the textual layer in the work is a collaboration with writer and curator Victoria Ivanova. And we were also very much interested in thinking circulation, actually, and think about circulation beyond, let's say, the current paradigm of the global, where the global is only about circulation for capital and wealth and extraction and homogenization. So we were also interested not only in repatriation, but also in not only in sense, but like how can we also move beyond, let's say, this question of the nation and of the patria. What is a country? Or where do these objects belong to? Also, because in the case of the Parthenon marbles, they were, for example, they were extracted from the Parthenon while Athens was under Ottoman rule. So the Greek state, the Greek nation state, didn't really exist at that time. It was a British ambassador who apparently obtained a permit from the Ottoman Empire to remove these sculptures from the Parthenon. But of course, the Greek nation state didn't exist at that time. And this is also somehow part of, let's say, the controversy. Of course, I do believe that Greece has full right to claim the objects back. But we were also interested in say, making these marbles, these performative Parthenon marbles, circulate across borders. So, So let's say that if we are to take the argument of the British Museum, like many big universal museums, claims that it shows global heritage, so that it has amassed and is now showing global heritage in a context that can put one object in relation to another. I think the intention was also to try to make the Parthenon marbles truly global heritage, so to truly make them available for circulation in other contexts. And for example, after they had been performed on the Acropolis and at State of Concept, they were also performed in Moscow at the Museum of Modern Art in a partnership between KADIST and the VAC Foundation. So one edition of the work was acquired, collected by KADIST, and it is also the edition that was shown now in Tokyo. They have also circulated in Porto, in Portugal. They were installed and performed in the Stock Exchange Palace. In Tokyo, right now, the Museum of Contemporary Art. And there is also there is a planned exhibiting of these marbles in Çanakkale, which is a small city in Turkey, who has actually a quite mixed population of both Turkish and Greek nationals. So, and it's a quite small context. It's a biennial, but it's a small city. So it's not one of these places where, let's say again, you would have proper resources or possibilities to even maybe show or to loan the original the original marbles. And I think there also so another important part about the work, besides this attempt to, let's say, dematerialize the original sculptures and rematerialize them in different locations through the bodies of performers situated in different places. And usually there is also a demand that two of the performers have some connection to Greece. Not necessarily in a national way, but there is some relation there, either heritage or some form of relation, so that, let's say, the fees that the performers receive somehow return, or even in a symbolic way, there is a return of more concrete value to Greece as well. In Tokyo, because basically when the exhibition was supposed to open, really the pandemic situation exploded, and it kind of exploded everywhere. And while we kept trying to see if we can make it happen, if we make the work happen at a later date, at some point it became quite clear that I will not be able to travel between continents and teach the work, that it was also complicated to think about a work with 5 live performers indoors with a lot of speech. And for this particular occasion, we decided, and I think it was a correct decision, to turn the work into a solo. So it was performed only by one person, one performer, who took on the whole material. And we thought about that. I think somehow because it became quite fragile, instead of this alliance, let's say, between more bodies who form also groups, sculptural groups. So it feels like there is some strength in this coming together, even if it's 5 performers. Somehow the one body also felt quite fragile, felt even maybe more fragile from this point of view of appropriating and rewriting history, or offering a different story about these objects. But somehow I think that at this particular moment in time, it also felt like one insists with the possibility of liveliness to move across, to move ideas also, and different stories, and to tell different stories across borders also. So bodies can receive and can be this medium where information still passes through and is able to move across borders. So there is this more, let's say, poetic aspect to the work, but I think another important one is also its insistence, in a very honest, I think, and non-cynical way, on the financial function of art today. So it really tries to identify very concrete economic advantages that come with having amassed these large collections of objects, which then, of course, also send, let's say, to this whole concept of an asset. And how an art object becomes an asset today. And of course, if you don't only think about ethnological museum collections or these universal museum collections, I think we can also think about free ports and these very large storage spaces for artworks that are never really meant to even be exhibited or publicly shown or even privately enjoyed. It's all about accumulation in a way, and accumulation of assets. So there is the textual layer also includes this. I hope this quite sharp analysis of what it means to, what are the exact economic ramifications of a particular collection or situation. And we were also interested, I say we, because again, the text was a collaboration also with Victoria Ivanova, in looking a bit into this concept of a financial derivative. Well, the derivative is also something that is based on another source, but in the world of finance, it also implies, let's say, a dislocation, an abstraction, a dislocation of value from an underlying material, mostly material object, let's say, and a possibility to produce more value through circulation, and also, let's say, to to create more value for those who circulate or manipulate this rather abstract value, let's say. Well, we are very, very much influenced also by the writings of Randy Martin, who was late Randy Martin. Unfortunately, he passed away, I think, in actually 2000, maybe 18 even, who was a dancer and also theorist working with finance. So he was very much interested in connecting these two apparently very different fields, but fields in which value is made in motion, and it is quite immaterial in a way. So the work also implied this possibility to, let's say, to redistribute value in while even referencing this financial concept of the derivative, while at the same time acknowledging again the ways in which finance can also, of course, produce this and in support this ongoing accumulations of value in particular places. I'm trying to see if I'm trying to understand if I might have missed offering some important information about the work. But perhaps this could be maybe enough for now, and I would be happy to maybe speak more about it in relation to questions or in a dialogue.
Thank you, both Tom and Alexandra, for your wonderful presentations. And I found there's a lot of rich themes to dig into in both of your individual presentations, and there are also a lot of correspondences to tease out between your two practices, particularly the theme of repatriation and monuments, which both of you have kind of returned to over the course of your practices. But I think maybe to tease out or to kind of insert a kind of lever for getting to those deeper subjects, I'd like to come at things from a bit of a sideways angle. And one thing that I felt when I was going through the exhibition the other day and looking at the works in the context of the exhibition was that there's a kind of connection between the two of you in terms of translation. So as I was watching Alexandra's performance piece, I felt that I could understand that this was a text that had been translated from one language into another, which the performer was then reciting, and there was a very physical component to the recitation. I could tell that the performer was concentrating on both creating these figures with his body while reproducing the text. And so I had the impression almost that one was translating these postures into a speech, or that the speech was being translated into postures. And of course, the postures are themselves being taken from the Parthenon marbles. So there are these multiple dynamics of translation, which become all the more relevant when you mention, Alexandra, that you had to adjust the work for the Tokyo context because of the coronavirus pandemic. On the other hand, with Tom, your work reminds me of the kind of etymological roots of the word translation as a kind of bringing across or transference. And so you're looking at how the Shalal mosaic was transferred from its original site in Palestine to an Australian context, and you are in turn returning that mosaic back to Palestine in a kind of back translation gesture. But of course, anyone who's played around with Google Translate would know that a back translation never returns to the original text. It creates a new text. And so also with this idea of the derivative, that there's kind of an endless process of creating new meaning. And I think that can be, Edward Said's Orientalism is actually very much rooted in a critique of translation as a kind of a colonial enterprise. But at the same time, as both your works show, it can be an emancipatory, a means to emancipation as well, potentially. So I wonder if you could both, maybe talk about how you see translation playing out in your works, especially under the coronavirus situation.
I don't know. How do you prefer to start, or?
You go first, Alexandra.
Okay. I will start from your comment, Andrew, about the movement in the Parthenon marbles work being referring the sculptural postures. The movement doesn't refer all the sculptures, right? So there was anyway a selection of what could work as a basis to produce, in a way, new forms, because there is a literal translation at work where, of course, the sculpture are used as reference for human bodies and for particular arrangements that might look different, right? When they are they can be seen in a three-dimensional way and so on. So the work, let's say, does not remain very faithful to the original sculptures, also because most of them are not complete. So there are also these situations where, let's say, the torso is in the British Museum and there's an arm that is in Athens. In this Acropolis Museum that was specifically built actually to host this Parthenon marbles that would return at some point to Athens. So there's an almost empty space at the top of the Acropolis Museum in Athens with cast reproductions of some of the sculptures and some original pieces also, because some of the original pieces also remained in Athens. But there's an interesting taking apart of these bodies. So you have one arm there, one leg there, the torso, and it's very interesting also to think in this way about the whole situation. So sometimes I took the freedom to complete an incomplete sculpture in a particular way that I felt produces the kind of visuality and dynamics that I was interested in. And in that sense, for me, sometimes the works that reference already existing objects or sculptures, or I also have works in relation to public monuments, the references sometimes also become a reason to speak about something. So the main intention might not be so much about what happens if we translate this to another context, but how can we speak about asymmetries of power today? What can we use? What sort of anchor points can we use to speak about this very contemporary issues? So somehow I think looking into history and rereading history from different perspectives in the end allows us to speak about the present and the future. And it's as much a use of the historical event or the object as the intention to speak about something that you feel at work today. And this is why I also wanted to use this very concrete reference. It lent itself well let's say, to this translation. But I feel it's a starting point to speak about many things that pertain actually to many topics. And as you mentioned previously, perhaps we come to also the question of collection and what is the function of art in today's economy. So I think the question of translation can also speak about that, let's say, or translation can also perform this function. Kind of. Yeah.
Tom?
I really like that as a set of observations, and the process and possibilities of translation was very critical to how that work evolved. Particularly not thinking about the process of returning the object in a one-to-one way, but thinking about the losses and additions that occur in its movements back and forward. And partly that was, of course, a visual thing, that there was a chance to, in reconstituting the Shalal mosaic with a different chromatic system, with different kinds of tiles, there was a chance to figuratively play with what the thing does and what it signifies. But it also has a tacit political implication in relation to the right of return and what it is to imagine processes of repatriation in a political sense, or and the acts of imagination that are required for that to happen. It also, when I was hearing you speak, I was also reminded of the discipline in which I'm trained, which is drawing. And drawings actually appear very frequently in this project. There were drawings of the Shalal mosaic that were made at different stages. And of course, drawing as a preparatory medium is something I used very extensively with the Mosaic Centre in making those mosaics that are on exhibition in Tokyo. And drawings, I think, are very distinctive as a medium, because they invite acts of translation. I mean, very often drawings are preparatory things. They're drawings for a painting or for a sculpture or for a building. And so the very act of drawing, I think, seems to anticipate or invite an act of translation. And that, to me, was a little bit connected to something which I hope is there in the work, which is that in the same way that a drawing often suggests that there is something yet to be, there is something which is to become, an incompleteness or something which needs to be realised or imagined out of what you see. I hope that the work itself has something of this quality, that your mind has to translate those fragments of mosaics onto that hilltop and to imagine them there, to imagine them being reconstituted at that place. And so I think there's something also of a translation in that as well, which is also, I was reminded of that listening to Alexandra talking about dematerializing, because there's obviously a sense in which her work also involves a translation in relation to materiality that seems quite important. It also struck me as funny that both of our works deal with the question of repatriating objects that were taken from an empire that no longer exists. They're both stolen from the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah, it was the same when I listened to your presentation. I guess maybe I can add something, because you brought in the question of materiality, and I realized I didn't maybe fully reply to also what your question was, Andrew, translating movement or presence across across the screen, which I find to be actually it's an impossible task in a way, of course, and I think there was so much discussion, at least as far as I could tell, enabled by the pandemic situation, about how information circulates, and learning, processes of learning and of exchanging information, that of course, as this now started to happen a lot online. And I think there's a lot of discursive information that becomes even maybe more easy to transmit and to share. but making a work that is a lot about placing bodies in space and the embodied experience of space, making that online is quite difficult. So there's a difficulty also of translation, which I think it's always important to acknowledge, and also in relation to this production of new meaning and the new situations that appear, and then how you work with that is also a question of imagination. I guess to give maybe one concrete example, also because the work was now performed by one performer, by Takumi, there is this duet form where one woman in the sculpture ensemble lays or supports or finds as a support this other woman's body. And the text speaks about the mutual indebtedness and how we are mutually indebted to each other. And then you only had this one body alone. And we found this posture that still looks as if you are laying on an invisible support. So there's something invisible there that supports you, but the impossibility to actually give your weight to this invisible body also creates a certain tension in this one body that is left alone and that tries to perform as if there is some support there. So somehow I think there were new meanings and new subtle differences in the work that were forced somehow by this situation, but that I feel were good. So I think there was also something productive and generative in these constraints. Let's say, and the process of translation itself can go one way or another, or it's still an open. What comes out of it is maybe the important question.
Right. Well, I think translation is also driven by a lack. There's a fundamental emptiness at the heart of translation, which is what produces the translation, because you don't know what the other person is saying. So you have to compensate for that. But both of your works deal with movement and circulation of people and objects. And until quite recently, we could imagine that as a physical journey that either you as the artist would be taking, or that a viewer would fly from Tokyo to Athens to participate, to go see Documenta and encounter your work there, or someone might happen to be in Palestine and see Tom's work in the Calandria International. And now, of course, we can't really physically travel, and so that movement or circulation has to take place as a projection. That's how do you kind of see that affecting your interpretation of circulation in your works?
Maybe you want to start this time, Tom, so that we...
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this as I was just preparing to come online, how strange it is to have this conversation about a work which really relies and is about and centers upon the movement of things and people between places. And I had to install the work via Skype. I mean, in a way, there's an ambivalence in my work, I think, towards the monument as a tradition, the classical monument as something which in most respects is something to utterly repudiate. I mean, of course, it's interesting the different ways that it persists, like the desire for some forms in which express collective experiences or aspirations in collective spaces. But in general, I think these three works that I talked about, and certainly the work that's in the exhibition, tries to think itself against the conventional monument. And one of the ways it does that is that it's quite invested in the imaginary. I mean, each of those three projects, comparative monument projects, they're works which exist as imaginary things, as propositions. And in that sense, they may be well suited to travelling in a coronavirus world. they're files that can be printed elsewhere, and they more rely on trying to conjure the idea of something rather than marble and bronze and the overblown authority and solidity of the classical monument. So on one hand, there is a way that I think the things that both Alexandra and I have been talking about, they can circulate in ways that are more imaginary or in light ways. I mean, having said that, I think one of the things that my work attempts to respond to is the very remarkable tradition of internationalism, both within Palestine itself and also in Aboriginal politics here in Australia, and the ways that connections that are created through the violence and dispossession of imperialism can actually then produce lateral forms of connection and solidarity and responsibility. And those things do rely on people gathering. So it's, at the moment, I'm sort of at the beginning of working on a new project in Palestine and contemplating what it is to try to realise it without being there and without meeting people and without being in that landscape, I think is difficult actually, and it's really challenging.
I would pick it up from here. Actually, I hope the situation improves very soon because I don't think there can be a true exchange without physicality and without being physically in the same place. And again, actually talking about discrepancies and asymmetries, it's not so hard to circulate within particular areas. So it's hard. Where you want to travel is also a question. I've recently opened some exhibitions in Western Europe within the Schengen area, and it's easy to travel between these places, right? That are somehow close together, that have the borders still quite open. Come from Romania, for example, in order to be able to move around now, I have to undergo different procedures, and there are different restrictions. So again, I think this particular moment makes even more visible certain issues that pertain to geopolitics, to power, wealth, and infrastructure, and so on. So it's not as hard to move around for everyone. It's not equally difficult. And of course, even me, I mean, if we talk about migration and of course refugee crisis and so on, we already know that circulation was not possible even before the coronavirus. It was not everyone had equal access everywhere. So this just, I guess, amplifies and creates a new set of gates and new gatekeepings, but I think that the solution lies in the possibility to circulate and also to travel. And here, I guess, because there's also such a pertinent critique of the economy of the arts that was made also now, I guess now in relation to the COVID crisis, that perhaps we don't need these huge art events where people fly in from all over the world and that gather all these artists in one space and that produce also this economy around them. But that shouldn't mean that anyone shouldn't be able to travel, because again, and I would like to be able to travel also outside Western Europe, right? In a way, it's nice, of course, to be able to do things there and now, but I had a very beautiful and maybe some of the most interesting experiences really across spaces in places that were very different also culturally. There's a lot of difference within Europe, so this is another thing that has to be acknowledged. There's no one Europe, that has never really been. So the issue of circulation I think remains just as crucial, and I hope that something something changes the current situation, and that something is also a matter of politics and political decisions as much as it is a question of a vaccine, of science or technology. It's always about the possibility for everyone to acquire a particular medicine, for example, whether it is available also to poorer countries, and where, so I think it's a very urgent question, and it can only be resolved in a political way. As far as my works are concerned, I think there are solutions, especially for the partner marbles. I'm also not traveling to Çanakkale now, to Turkey. I cannot travel. So we're also doing this online process where they also, there's a local performer with some training in choreography that also helps assisting, translating my intentions into that space for the performers. There's also, of course, the question of language. And again, this also, it's something that I didn't mention. Even in Tokyo, we had a translator, so I couldn't directly communicate with the performer. And Kyungfa also made this work that was very much hands-on and became part of somehow the whole choreographic process, which I think is great. I mean, I thought it was a very nice situation, difficult nevertheless. And it's the same now in Turkey. So there's another language issue there, but that I think also can produce, I mean, in the end, you want to engage also, and you want to make things happen across these borders and across these divides that are also linguistic. And I'm speaking English, but this is also not my native language. So I'm already accepting a form of translation and mediation, or what is not in the end between ourselves. I hope it can be better embodied and different layers in the future.
We have a question from our audience. Goso Tominaga talks about how from both your works, I felt the dreamlike power of trying to challenge irreversibility, or the power of trying to dream. In the Corona Rec, these powers create great hope and courage. Thank you very much. Please tell us your recent impressive dream.
It's very beautiful. I mean, dreams. It's very nice to think about dreams, actually, and especially at this moment. I also have some nightmares, so it's harder for me to speak about a recent dream. I think that the dream would be for a more radical shift in how we understand each other and the world and the relations between each other coming out of this crisis. I think this would be the dream, a change in thinking, economics also, sustainability in relation to not to ongoing inequality, but to redistribution of wealth, resources, power, thinking of land, and sustaining life together. I felt like there was a moment, especially in the beginning of the lockdown, because in Romania we also underwent a full lockdown. And when things kind of synchronized with other places in the world, it felt like this pause or this break, this interruption could be generative. And then somehow things continued and adjusted, and I felt like, no, like let's hold on to this interruption. So maybe this would be the dream, that that something a bit more radical happens, because there will be more crises. I feel like we're anyway living from one crisis to the next. The crisis is a bit the general condition today. So the possibility to interrupt or to coordinate some forms of generative interruptions that would give us time to think and act differently, that would be a dream.
I feel like I've been doing more dreaming than usual during coronavirus, but I don't think any of them are very impressive, to be honest. I mean, it's certainly made me very conscious of vicarious things. I mean, at the moment in Melbourne, actually, we have been in very acute lockdown for the last 6 weeks because of a second wave. So I also would dream of just being able to get my hair cut, actually, and other things that are very banal. But I do think that I think what Alexandra said is very true. It's caused a kind of pause and a moment where a whole lot of things might be rethought. The difficulty here, I think, at least where I am, is it's very profoundly atomizing, and so thinking of ways to be together and to dream collectively is one of the challenges. And actually, one of the things, it's interesting because before I was just extolling the virtues of thinking monuments without the materiality and the excessive weight of monuments. But I think actually one of the things that I most miss during this period is the thingness of artworks and being around objects and with objects, and the kind of dreaming that produces. That produces a very particular kind of dreaming. The actual thing of an artwork and its surprises and all of the things that are unexpected about it. And I really miss that kind of dreaming.
Right. And you have both had some great phrases: generative interruption from Alexandra and dreaming collectively from Tom. If we don't have any more questions, I hope viewers would take advantage. We only have 7 minutes left, so please submit questions if you have them. In the meantime, I'll ask a quick question about collections. Both of you have works about repatriation, and then both of your works are now held in collections, which is sort of, I wouldn't say it's the opposite of repatriation, but if one has a kind of circulatory dynamic to it, the other is kind of predicated on being in one place. So if you could talk about that, I think it would be interesting.
Should I go first this time? Thanks for the question. It's a very good question. And the Shalal mosaic, the Byzantine mosaic that was stolen from Palestine, in a way, the fact of it being in the Australian War Memorial speaks of a quite dystopic idea of a collection, where to possess an object is also to try to claim its authority for yourself, which is certainly what it is in the Australian War Memorial, in a very bizarre way, that a 6th century object from Palestine near Gaza comes to be something which is held in that as a claiming a kind of Christian patrimony in that building. So the work begins with something which is a quite dystopic idea of a collection, and it actually does. The work I made does exist in a collection in Sydney, and it was always conceived as an addition of two, so that one could also find its way back to Palestine itself, if ever that were possible. But the work is sort of suspended at the moment at which it conceives of the idea of returning. So there's a kind of an idea of suspension in there, which I do think is also part of what happens with a work in a collection, that it can live in a collection in a very vital way, but it's also suspended in some way in a particular moment in its life. I like something that Alexandra said much earlier about repatriation, and she alluded to the etymology of that word, patria, and the way it implies nationhood. And one of the things which I love about being in Palestine and amongst political thinkers in Palestine is not just their courage, but also the way that heterogeneity and a state which is of its citizens, which is inherently pluralistic, is so deeply embedded in that way of resisting. And there's something of that pluralism which I hope is actually within the processes of the project itself, in that it entangles a whole lot of different histories and moments in the object of the Shalal mosaic. And there's something of that maybe in a more hopeful idea of a collection, the opposite of a war memorial, which with its celebration of violence and nations and militarism, but the idea of a collection which somehow enables heterogeneity or pluralism to live. And I don't know what that looks like. I mean, in some ways, the thing that my work asks you to imagine, which is that thing is repatriated not to a collection or a museum, but to a hilltop, and it becomes a way to be in a landscape and to look out from that artwork and to stand on it and to look at the landscape. And I guess that is the ambition of many of many artworks and artists, to make a work which is also simply a way to be in the world and to see things. And it's a necessity in some ways that things exist in a collection, but it's also part of the political tensions that artworks contain. And certainly my one is no different in that way.
I also think there can be an ambiguity to the very notion of a collection. In a way, it doesn't have to be about amassing large amounts of objects, but I feel it can also be about taking care. It can be about taking care of objects or practices. So in a sense, I feel like especially when performative works become part of collections, because it's a medium that sells so rarely. It's such a market now. I feel like that this question becomes even stronger. How because it implies so much effort, or not so much effort, but some effort to reinstall it. So it becomes a lot about taking care or wanting to move this into the future and help it circulate and persist. Yes. So I feel like the term collecting or collection can be ambivalent, and meaning is anyway, ambivalent or constructed in relation to practice and materiality. Then I also wanted to say, within the text of the Parthenon marbles, there is actually this speculative. It has quite a strong, also speculative feeling to it, but there is this idea that the work becomes part of a public collection. However we can describe even a public collection today, I think it would be an interesting question for maybe another moment, because again, what is public was generally, I guess, understood as something pertaining to the state. But perhaps it can be something that simply cannot be contained. To a certain extent, I also feel like the moving, speaking, performative works that I try to make are not supposed to be contained. They also cannot be perfectly enclosed and contained. If someone comes and watches the work and learns the text and remembers the movement, right? You can collect the work as well by seeing it, by learning it. So it's never meant to be contained or enclosed, and it cannot be stored somewhere. It cannot be it cannot be possessed in that sense. So I think there's always a question of also taking care of. Of course, without romantic, I mean, of course, it can also be possessed. You can still get loan fees and so on. So it's also a question of benefiting, let's say, from this taking care of. But I feel it can also escape this idea of possession. And I also wanted to mention that while we were rehearsing and already making the work with State of Concept in Athens, we got in touch with the Acropolis Museum. So this large museum that was made around, and it was financed again to host this returning Parthenon marbles. And Iliana Fukianaki of State of Concept, she got in touch with them and tried to explain the project that we're working on, a contemporary art project dealing with the Parthenon marbles, because initially we were also thinking that could be interesting to perform the works there, especially since there was this almost empty floor, and they just replied that they're not interested in contemporary art. So this, even in a way, before seeing or having any more detailed understanding of what the work is, so there was already somehow this kind of rejection of what we want the sculptures and not some contemporary artwork. So there was this intention, and here I think is where we can also talk a bit about imagination and how we imagine also different ways of redistributing value or dislocating these accumulations of wealth and power that might not have always to do with very direct forms of moving the things around again.
Yeah, I like ending on a note of dislocation. I think that's quite productive. Thank you both for your really fantastic answers to the questions.
For the question.
Thanks for your great talk, and also to Andrew. I was remembering a lot about the process of rehearsal, and the moment when Takumi, this performer, started, the performance in the gallery. All the audience suddenly became so aware of their bodies in the space. I told you a bit, Alexandra. That was quite an interesting moment that I captured, and that's definitely connected to the moment that we have the COVID crisis. And I have the same sort of interesting moment with Tom's work. The very first day we opened, I was in the gallery watching the audience, and this intensity of seeing the energy that they put to face objects. I could almost feel it, like it was almost like tangible energy. So yeah, I mean, like you said, we need this, contact with people, but also with objects, and I still keep wondering what it is. But we have already passed the time. So anyway, thank you so much again. And for the audience, we will have another session next Friday with Dale Harding and Asaku Iwama. So please come back. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.